Miko, how are you?
I'm great, Carlos. How are you?
Doing well. Welcome back to another Mindful Techie Tuesday episode.
Yes, and excited to be here. And as always, thank you for setting up the beautiful studio and making sure that everything is working well for us. And so excited to be here about this week's conversation. We're going to be extending what we've been talking about this week, actually the past couple of weeks about the remote work environment.
Yeah.
But we're adding a new twist into this, which is homeschooling, right? So you have kids, right, Carlos? Right?
I have two girls, both in elementary school, and yeah, homeschooling has been fun. I think I've fired myself, and my wife has fired herself many times over in this situation.
Yeah, so definitely a new appreciation for the work that our educators are doing for our children, as well as a new appreciation for the need around the social and emotional support. You know, because
Sure.
it's not just the learning of the specific subjects or topics, but there's a social and emotional learning component that goes along with that.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I'm excited because we've got Mark, our guest, on today, and looking forward to your conversation and your chat with him and diving in further in terms of just like learning a bit more about like what's happening out there, what some best practices that we can help our viewers just kind of engage with in terms of this balance of remote work and homeschooling. So, what do you say we bring Mark on just for a quick hello?
Sounds good.
Mark, how's it going?
Hey everyone.
Hi, Mark. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
And we're happy to have you here. So for folks that are new to me or new to Carlos or new to Mark, I want to welcome you to this week's edition of Mindful Techie Tuesday. This is an opportunity for us to talk about all things at the intersection of mindfulness and technology. And I want to invite you to love, like, share, comment, tag someone in the comments if you think this conversation is going to be useful or impactful for you or someone else in your network. Today, we're going to be talking about the intersection of virtual work in the current environment with COVID-19, as well as homeschooling. And I'm excited this week, especially for our guest that we have. So Mark is the founder of a platform called Social Sector Titan. And it's a platform for those who want to radically improve their performance at work in the sector. So he's all about helping people who are doing good work do good work better. And he is also a disaster response expert who works with nonprofits, including organizations like the United Nations, the Red Cross, and governments all across the world to respond to natural disasters and wars around the globe. And so he is uniquely situated to really help us to understand not only the context in which we are operating today, but to help us to understand some long-standing principles and practices that we can be implementing as we are working remotely and homeschooling in the current environment. So, Mark, welcome.
Thank you so much, Miko. It's great to be here. And just wanted to give a shout out to your work also in this mindfulness and technology space. The messages you've been putting out in the world have been super helpful. I've learned a lot from them personally, and it's great to have this conversation today.
Well, awesome. We appreciate you being here, and I appreciate that feedback. So let's just start with how you're doing. So there's a lot going on in the world with COVID-19, with the protests in response to George Floyd's death, and I know that you do a lot of traveling, and so tell us where are you in the world? It's like you're like Carmen Sandiego. So where are you in the world right now? How are you doing?
Yeah, great. I like the Carmen Sandiego reference there. Classic. I'm calling in from Central Virginia today. Live here with my family, and I definitely travel a lot for work, and those trips are not happening so much. So the work now is completely remote until we can figure out how to all travel and how to do this international disaster response work in a safe way. Although the work is continuing with people who are located on the ground in these various crises, so we're trying to find a way through. Overall, it's been quite an intense year. We've all been feeling the different forces that are happening, and for me personally, it has been a lot to handle and a lot of incoming issues. I do enjoy intensity, and I like when there are challenges to overcome just as a person. So I do look at this on the positive side as being a good test of systems and principles that I try to develop for myself and share with other people. And but at the same time, acknowledging that it's really hard, and a lot of the things that are happening are hard for everyone. And my heart goes out to everybody who's suffering because of this, because those feelings are real, and it's a super intense time. And I know that for myself, I've kind of gone through a huge range of reactions and emotions from dealing with this current state of the world. Everything from relishing the additional challenge to being really down and fearful about it all. So I think that's but those are, I know from being in other disasters around the world and other tough situations, those are natural emotions, and everybody goes through those ups and downs. So that's kind of where I am right now.
All right. Well, awesome. Well, we're glad that you are here and that you're relatively well, and then your family is good as well. Is that right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we're lucky in that we can do a lot of our work remotely. Both my partner Kirsten and I can do remote work, and our kids have the chance to, they had the chance to study remotely, and we have a safe and good environment for them here, which we're fortunate in that way. I know not everybody has that setup, but we're thankful for that.
All right, awesome. And how many? You said you have two kids. So what are their ages?
Yeah. So we've got two kids, 5-year-old and a 9-year-old.
Okay.
And we've got two parents, two working parents, and then two kids who have been homeschooling and now have just gone into the summer period. So we're and I should have mentioned before that I do a lot of traveling, I do a lot of in-person stuff, but I also did work remotely for many years, with teams based across the world and in different parts of the country, in different setups and arrangements. And so I did have a good read on the remote work part, but then throwing in the homeschooling component of that was just an incredible shift and change. So that's been the issue.
Okay, awesome. So I want to come back and dive deeper into some of those things. So one of the things that you talked about the emotional impact of living through and responding to disaster. So I definitely want to come back to that. And I wanted you to give us the context for your kids, because I think that the setup that you describe is very similar to what a lot of folks right now are experiencing. Being parents that are perhaps privileged enough to be able to work from home in this current environment, but then they're also adding on top of that responsibility, also homeschooling. So I do want to come back to that, but I wonder if, as a starting point, you can tell us a little bit about the work that you do and how has your work changed as a result of COVID-19?
Yeah. Okay. Great. So I'll try to talk about the two things that really fire me up right now and that get me excited in the professional sense are this work of international disaster response, and so that means that there are different kinds of wars and natural disasters happening in different parts of the world. I think it's important to flag, even with everything that's going on right now with social strife and with the COVID outbreak, that this is one of the best times in history, actually, just from a pure statistical perspective, and from a safety perspective. There's less. So we've come so far as vaccinations globally, public health interventions, and also just violence in general is going way down. So the world is getting much better overall, but it still needs to be better. And there's still bad places in the world where, difficult things are happening from a disaster perspective. So I work when countries don't have a strong response system on their own. Our example of a strong response system is FEMA at the federal level and the different state response agencies. When those organizations in other countries are need support, they request international assistance. So I'm part of the technical support that goes to those different natural disasters and wars. That's everything from different kinds of relief supplies to various programs that help people in those settings. And specifically, I've worked in a bunch of different parts of that over my nearly 20 years doing it so far. But I've moved more from the strategy and management side, more towards the data and analytics side. So working with data and information to try to understand what's happening in these different environments and bring that insight to decision makers. So, because I'm a disaster response professional, when COVID set in, this is the kind of thing that we're doing in various forms already. So it was just a shift to look more at that specific new emerging pandemic and from the health perspective, and try to understand the different data that's coming out around it and make that understandable and useful for decision makers. So yes, it's a new threat, but I was already working along those lines before, and so it's just a kind of an adjustment to that new way of working. And then, of course, the other thing that I love to talk about and work on, which we've engaged on a bunch, is on the kind of the human performance side in that social type of work. There's a great body of knowledge in everything from psychology to entrepreneurship to military about how to perform well in kind of rugged environments or high stakes situations. And I love learning those things for myself and then writing about them and trying to share them in our social sector context. And I know that you've keyed into this really well with your work, that there's a huge amount of benefit to practicing some of these techniques, and specifically in our social sector type of context, and can make us able to be happier and help other people better. So that's what's kind of my professional focus these days.
Well, awesome. So I appreciate you sharing that. So I want to dive deeper into how COVID-19, specifically as it relates to remote work, how that has changed for you, and what's different for you. Because you mentioned before that as a disaster response expert, you're accustomed to, you and your colleagues are accustomed to responding to disasters along the scale of COVID-19. But what's different about how you're impacted now, specifically in the context of remote work?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Definitely great question. It's for me personally, my partner Kirsten jokes all the time that nothing has actually changed for me since I was working remotely, and I thrive in an environment where I can do deep work in a remote sense and then come together with other people and share it. But that's there definitely have been some impacts despite that joke. There are obviously the kind of sequence of going somewhere and engaging with people and being intensely together, and then being remote and doing the analysis and doing the work. That one half of that equation is gone for now. So everything has to be remote. So for me personally, I was able to make that shift. You do miss that in-person contact that can make a big difference in building rapport and understanding different dynamics and situations and problems more directly in person. But there's still so much that we can do remotely if we have the right tools to collaborate and to share ideas and do designs together and get good results. But I think the biggest change for me has been kind of being there and witnessing and trying to help where I can the whole rest of the humanitarian system and, you know, the world that is able to work remotely to quickly move to that remote setting. I know for myself, it was really hard in the beginning when I started working more along those lines and having to set up systems and processes to work remotely for myself. And then seeing everyone have to do that really quickly under this like duress of a pandemic, and still be able to try to do their work as best they can. You know, that's been, you know, I know it's been really hard for a lot of people, but I've seen a lot of people just make that transition. That took me probably several years. Like took them, you know, only a few weeks, just because it had to be done. So those are some of the you know, the things that are different right now is just being a part of that remote work approach and effort that everybody's doing it. And now all of a sudden, rather than just, you know, very kind of isolated parts of the social sector or the humanitarian system working in that way. And of course, big shout out to the many professions that don't have that choice, right? And there is this huge dichotomy between the things that can't stop or are not able to stop, and then the things that can continue, but in a remote stance. So it's been fascinating to watch and try to learn from.
So you mentioned the duress of folks who've had to make this change in a really rapid pace compared to the number of years that you've had to prepare and to get your setup in place, get your mindset aligned with that. Can you speak, if at all, to the trauma that maybe the secondary trauma folks might be experiencing as a result of, not only as a disaster preparedness and disaster response expert, you are dealing with the trauma, a secondary trauma perhaps related to what you're witnessing and what you're responding to, right?
Sure.
But then in this context, folks who hadn't worked from home a lot, having to shift and deal with COVID, right? And deal with a disaster that was not only impacting them someplace far away, but now impacting them where they live. Can you speak to that, if at all, based on your experience with your colleagues?
Sure. Yeah. No, great question. That trauma is definitely real, and those feelings, you know, are something that is very, very tangible and real. And you know, for me personally, you know, my first job out of university was working with refugees who had experienced, had to flee their countries and were trying to get you know, apply to get refugee status in the U.S. I was a caseworker, actually just sitting down with people and listening to their stories and writing down all the things that happened to them to make them flee. And so I had a very direct experience with what you mentioned as the secondary trauma, and the other way to talk about it is say vicarious trauma, right? I think is the more technical term for it. So, you know, and I actually experienced a lot of impacts from that. This is in the early 2000s when, you know, staff care systems weren't very well set up or understood. And so I definitely had to deal with a lot of issues related to that I had to work through over the years. So, you know, I've been in situations where I've directly seen, you know, difficult things in the field. But then when you're hearing somebody else talk to you about it, and in that secondary level, it still does have an impact. So it's something that we all have to think about right now when the disaster has come home to us, you know, all throughout our country in various degrees. And I do think that that's an issue that's going to play out. It's playing out right now, and then it's going to play out, you know, in the coming years. That, you know, when you do experience that trauma, even if you don't see it directly, you know, we're not all seeing COVID patients every day. We're not seeing directly with our own eyes the various struggles that are going on all the time. So, you know, we hear about it, we might talk about it with people, we might, you know, see it in various media sources, but it definitely all has an impact, and it needs to be dealt with. And, you know, I would just encourage people to like know that that's an important thing to think about and deal with. And there's so many different ways of going about that, and everybody has to make their own choices about it. But it's a real potential problem that I've dealt with myself directly. I know that other people are going to have similar experiences, or I assume that other people have similar experiences with not just COVID, but the other types of issues that are going on right now with the protests and with the movements for social change. Like those all have an impact on our minds and bodies, even if we're not right there on the front lines of it. So because it's all around us, we have to find ways to deal with that in a way that makes sense for each of us, it's a very personal choice, but it's worthwhile to do the work on that proactively rather than waiting for the impacts to hit later, which is what I did in the early days.
Yes. And so to that point, I do want to ask you, you mentioned that it's an individual choice. People have to figure out what works for them, but I'm curious if you have any recommendations on an individual level and also on an organizational level. And I will, as you're thinking about that, one of the things I wanted to share is that, particularly with the work that I do around the intersection of mindfulness and technology, one of the ways that I describe what we're experiencing, folks that aren't directly involved, right, that we are experiencing what I describe as post-traumatic information disorder.
Right. I remember you posting about that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so essentially what that means is that we are connected in such a way that we're actually hyper connected in such a way that we have access to more tools and information than we've ever had before. And we are repeatedly exposed to information and news and social media about suffering and trauma that's happening all over the world. And I can't think of a better example than what's happening right now with the protests in response to George Floyd, right? So like, regardless of how people are thinking about this or framing this and how they're taking action, the fact of the matter is that video of him and the police officer with the knee on him has been played over and over again. The images of the protests and the looting that's happening being played over and over again. And then the streams from the news videos and people posting and really grieving in their own ways are filling our social media feeds with how people are responding on an individual level. So do you have any recommendations you can give us as someone who is an expert in this area in terms of responding to disasters and being aware of that this vicarious trauma does exist? What can we do on an individual level, and what can someone do, someone who runs an organization or who manages a team, what can they do to help their team members?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Great question. And yeah, I definitely have seen your posts on that post-traumatic info disorder issue, and it's definitely real. It's other words for it would be, info overload or just media overload. And I think those are really real issues. I do think it's important to realize that this movement for social change and the kind of progression, I believe to be positive progression that we're seeing now, is actually enabled by technology in so many ways. So much of technology is enabling us to have seen those last moments of George Floyd's life, and to be able to understand it on a very visceral level and then take the right action about it. So that's incredibly positive, and we know that there's always two edges to a wonderful tool like this, and so we can see the negative sometimes, and we can see the positive. On the positive side, just to know that we can create global movements for change, and we can connect people who have similar ideas. The world's knowledge is right at our fingertips wherever we want it. That's just what a unique moment in history that we can make that happen, and I love thinking about that. But it is possible to get overloaded with all that and to have that post-traumatic stress, because it is as if we had all witnessed that firsthand, and that does have impacts on all of us as people.
Yes.
And as an individual, I can only speak. I'm not a clinical. I'm a practitioner of these things, and I try them on myself. I try to learn, and I share what I learn. I'm definitely in a position from a clinical perspective to recommend anything, and there are great resources out there that that have that clinical edge that I can definitely point folks to. But for me personally, the answer to dealing with that comes with things like trying to find stillness in my day in various points. So trying to whatever works for you personally. For me, it's just a few minutes of meditation, and then journaling has made a big difference in me for myself in dealing with those kind of post-traumatic issues that come up. So write just different kinds of free form writing and prompts that come up, and then talking about it in various ways with professionals or with friends, and just confronting and acknowledging those issues, letting them come out rather than just tamping them down, or when hard things happen, just pretending like nothing happened. That's not the best way to deal with it. So those are the things that, from a personal perspective, that make a big difference for me. And then and on the personal side, then the other part is just making an effort to learn about what's going on, not just consuming media, doing it to a certain level to understand what's happening, but making sure to limit the overload. Other people have called it something like the low information diet, where you're I like to call it like the quality information diet, because I do want like a lot of quality information coming through to help me decide. So getting that high quality and trying to stay away from the noise. So that's on the personal side, like what's worked for me. On the organizational side, organizations are getting humanitarian, nonprofit, social sector organizations, I do believe, from my personal observation, are getting better at having resources available for their staff who are dealing with different kinds of trauma. So that's a great development that I've seen mostly in recent years. Yes. And then of course, making, even if there's not a dedicated team or a dedicated person in each organization, just having people like you and others in the network and in the community, making these types of issues known and available. There's just, again, back to technology, there's so many incredible resources that are available now to help with this, to help work through different types of trauma that exist and different challenges, and those things are available if you want to try to seek them out and do the work. It's there. And then, but the last thing on trauma too, I mean, trauma can be negative and can be real, but there can also be post-traumatic growth that comes from trauma. And I do feel like it can accelerate, when it's dealt with in the right way. It can really accelerate our learning and our kind of experience of life and our ability to give back. It tends to like any disaster setting that I've experienced, trauma, it can be a part of that, but it can also accelerate learning. It can accelerate experience. It can accelerate relationships that you have professionally and personally. It kind of compresses time. And I feel like we're feeling that a little bit as Americans now, when we're seeing, these different, the social change movements that are happening. And the COVID pandemic has, kind of compressed. I always see people making jokes about, it's already been feels like it's been 2 years since COVID started. That's the feeling of that compression that happens, that kind of distillation of like these strong emotions, and it can really be a huge advantage. It's not just always bad. So like looking for that upside in this type of thing can be really helpful also.
Well, awesome. So I appreciate you sharing that, and I will just reflect back to you what you shared, and to help our audience understand. So on the personal side, when it comes to dealing with the secondary or vicarious trauma that we're talking about, one of the things that you talked about was this idea of creating space or creating stillness in your day, in your life. You gave the example of meditation and journaling, both of which are really good personal practices, can certainly be done in a mindfulness based framework, which is how I would perhaps offer it or prescribe it to folks. But the really interesting thing too is that both of those actually have an evidence base behind those, right? So we know that with journaling, to be able to express your feelings, to be able to get those out. That's one way of actually helping people to actually process what's going on. And depending on the type of journaling, that can also be effective as well. And then, of course, we know there's a whole body of evidence that shows the effectiveness of meditation in a whole range of settings, particularly when it comes to addressing trauma and dealing with stress and anxiety. So I think you really gave us a lot to work with there. And then you talked about actually sharing and acknowledging what's happening. I was doing a training earlier today, and one of the things my co-facilitator and I talked about was the importance of, particularly at an organizational level, making space for your team to essentially acknowledge the context in which they're operating, right? To acknowledge that we're not living in a vacuum, to acknowledge that this is not normal, to acknowledge that this COVID-19, this is happening, to acknowledge that the protests are happening, that we're having this discussion about racial inequality and racial justice. And not that you need to have an answer, but to simply just make the space to acknowledge that those are the things that are happening. Sort of, pointing out that there's an elephant in the room as opposed to pretending that it's not there, right?
Totally, yes.
So critically important. And then the last thing that you mentioned about PTG, or post-traumatic growth, I posted about this too, because I think it's so important that oftentimes when we think about trauma, and I want the folks that are listening to hear this, that oftentimes when we think about trauma, we think about the negative impact of the trauma. But to your point about post-traumatic growth, trauma can also be an impetus for positive transformation, right? So there's something that we can, if we are positioning ourselves in such a way that we're actually able to figure out what's the lesson and what's the opportunity, then there's an opportunity to actually grow as a result of the trauma, and just not have it be this thing that sort of beat us down, where we're sort of a victim to that thing. Is that sort of what you're getting at when you talk about PTG, post-traumatic growth?
Yes, exactly. Very well said. I mean, it's hard to always look at it that way, and it's impossible to always look at it that way. And you risk sounding, insensitive to, what is a very real challenge, and can be really, really damaging sometimes. But it still does exist, and I've personally experienced it, and it's a real phenomenon. So there can be an upside to this, and the link that I make to this philosophically is the concept, the philosophy of Stoicism, from the ancient authors like Marcus Aurelius and Seneca.
Yeah.
It's kind of getting some play right now in various circles, and that's an ideal link back to that, where the challenges are the things that catalyze the best parts of growth. But there is still always a huge spectrum on that, right? And you can fall at various points on various parts of that spectrum. I know I always do. So it's not just a kind of like toughen up message. It's okay, there's a wide range of experiences and possibilities in these experiences, and in these on their face negative experiences. How can we move along from one side of total destruction from these to something that we can grow from, but never easy, but it's the right direction of travel.
Yes. And so is that part of the Stoicism that you were talking about? Is that part, I believe I've heard it said something along the lines of like the challenge or the obstacle is the way. It's not the thing you go around try to avoid. It's actually the only way you can get to your growth and to the other side, or to your evolution, is to actually go through the challenge. Is that the idea?
Yeah, exactly. That's along the lines of that, and it's just it goes back to that, the basically just your circle of control, about what doing an exercise where you draw on a sheet of paper a circle, and you put inside what you actually really control, and then what is actually outside of your control goes outside the circle.
Sphere of influence. Yes.
Yeah, sphere of influence. Yeah. That's another way of saying it. And if you do that exercise, you realize that actually there's not that much that's in the circle.
Yes.
It tends to end up being thoughts and actions, and then even then, like, thoughts will come into your head that you don't necessarily control, and you might do something that you didn't need to. So it's kind of a humbling process of realizing how much is so super outside of our control related to the pandemic and things like that. And conversely, it can seem like that's a disempowering message, but actually it ends up being the opposite if you can go through that thought process and realize that, okay, well, there are very few things that I can directly handle here. I'm gonna just double down on those and try to be aware and sensitive to everything else, but not let it take up too much brain space. Kind of back to the lower information intake, or just the higher quality information intake.
Yes, and so I think that was a really good way to go back to what you mentioned about the intake of all the information, right? So looking for information that's going to feed you, nourish you, and in other words, that's going to help you to be educated, right? But then at a certain point, you have to make a decision about how are you going to act based on what's in your sphere of influence. I think that we spend a lot of time, I think, in this place of fear about things that aren't real. And what I mean by not real is like we spend time thinking about things that either have already happened, right? So if it's already happened, then that means it's not real right now in this moment. Or we spend time being scared of things that might happen, things that haven't happened, right? And that's not real either because it hasn't happened. And we are losing sight of what we have in this moment that we have control over. So I think that's really, really important. So I do want to, in the time that we have remaining, I do want to move us along, and I want to talk specifically about remote work. So you mentioned that you have been doing this for many years, but that some of your colleagues have had to make the switch in, a matter of weeks when you've had so much more time to do this. Can you give us some of your top tips that have really helped you in terms of being able to work remotely successfully? Maybe give us 2 or 3 that you might recommend to folks maybe that are new or just having a hard time adjusting.
Sure, yeah, definitely. And I'll try to bring in the homeschooling dimension to this also, because it brings up, it forces us to be so much more on point with all this. And as context, I was actually homeschooled up until 9th grade. So I never set foot inside of school until 9th grade when I went to a public high school. So I have a very unique take on the homeschooling environment that I'll try to kind of link to after I talk about some of these strategies. So just the main like kind of top line strategies that it's a great place to start are related to first of all, just the mindset of trying to like see this as a chance to a good opportunity to test some of these things out, even though it's not something that we would have all necessarily chosen. Just like looking at it as, okay, here's my remote work lab. I get to do some experiments here and see what happens. And then it's going to be so different for everybody, but there are a few principles that you can use to try to just have a more enjoyable and kind of focused work day. And one of the first places to start is trying to look at what your specific job is and what your work is, and try to divide it into when you're making things, being a maker, and when you're a manager, managing things. And each one is equally important, and we all end up doing a bit of each of them. So making is things like writing, designing, doing something that's super focused and solving a problem, making a data graphic, anything like that, which is you have something tangible at the end of the process, and it requires like a very deep level of focus. And then on the managing side, you have to have by necessity a wider frame of reference. So you're less narrow, you're more in touch with different people and different things. You're having more meetings. You're involved with kind of following different processes and seeing how they all connect and intersect. And by nature, it's more kind of segmented, whereas the making, you need like more unbroken sections of time. So after you determine like how much you're making versus how much you're managing, then you can try to look at ways to set up your day so that you get enough time to do each one of those things. And if you're like me, you're doing a kind of mix of both. You want to try to batch like the similar tasks together. So anytime I'm doing managing stuff, I want to try to put all those calls together in one part of the day and then leave the rest of the day open to do like writing a document or making a data graphic or something like that. Me personally, that would be my ideal approach to it. And I know we don't always control this, but this is, you know, an idealized kind of principle-based approach. And then just adding into that, those elements of stillness that we found out at any times in your day that you can just get a few minutes to just like get, do that mental work of finding that quiet and it can just ripple out and focus and help the rest of your day. And then anytime you can move your body in a way that is enjoyable to you. So whether that's, you know, some kind of physical activity that's more intense, like running or biking, or, you know, whatever you do for your physical activity, or if it's just something super simple, like even just walking can make a huge difference. So the more you can do that in a natural setting, outside of walls, the more kind of recharge you're going to get, which is going to make you able to be a better maker or a better manager. So those are the kind of the top line things.
Okay. So you said a lot there. So you told us, and this is really, really solid information, really solid, practical strategy for folks. So the first thing that you mentioned was around mindset, if I were to summarize it that way, which is like how you actually approach the work. So getting your mindset, you know, in a place where you're like, okay, this is what we're doing. You know, it's not ideal, but we're going to try this out. We're going to experiment. We're going to see what happens. We're going to be open to what comes from this experience. So that sounds like that's the first thing, getting your head right, getting your head game. Sort of like with the basketball players and the football players, it's like there's the physical component, but then you have to actually get your head into the game. Like what that literally means is like you actually are there, that you're present, and you're focused on the intention for why you're actually there. So you got to get your head in the game. It sounds like, and then the other part of it is, it sounds like you have to be able to set up your day and understand at any given point in time, are you making something or are you managing something? Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I'm assuming based on your personality type and how you like to work, based on the types of tasks you have, organizing your day in a way that optimizes that for you. So it sounds like for you, batching works best for you, right? For someone who's more creative, maybe they need to like mix it up a little bit. So maybe they need to like have, you know, a call here and then work here and then a call there and work, or whatever it is. Or depending on your schedule, right? You mentioned homeschooling, which we're going to get to. You might have to break up your day just out of necessity because you're a caregiver for young children, or maybe an older person or loved one in your life. So that's pretty solid there as well. Talk about stillness, which we already talked about earlier today. So the different ways to do stillness. And then the last thing you mentioned, which is really important, around movement, right? Getting outside, moving your body, being sort of reinvigorated, re-energized by nature. So all of those are pretty solid things that I think are. I think sometimes we maybe take those for granted, but they're really important.
Yeah,
so
for sure.
Can you speak to that? Like because you mentioned that you've been doing this for years, and what you described sounds so basic,
Right.
yet it's so important.
Yeah, exactly. And it's ironically, like, yes, all those things are super basic, but they're everything except being on the computer and trying to get your work done gets immediately thrown out the window when you first try to work remotely. Right? And then you can't focus enough because you don't have a structure around you. So like, you can't even get that done. So that's the typical, like, you know, what I went through personally and what I see others going through in this, rapid remote work, adaptation that's happening. And so conversely, you summarize it really well, but underlying all of those ideas is the kind of counterintuitive thought that, when you have this ultimate freedom of remote work, whether you've chosen it or not, it's still a kind of an open space that you can shape with various external constraints. But you have that opportunity. Conversely, with that freedom, you have to actually create a structure for yourself that's going to work for you, both your personality and also your tasks. And you have to write that system down and put it on your calendar, whether it's an intention planner, like, your great product, or whether it's, a Google Calendar, if you use that system, or an Outlook calendar. You actually have blocks of time when you're only doing those things that you're supposed to do. And the more that you can create time for, that's not just being on calls and meetings, then you can shape your day in the way that, you have whatever you need to get done, and you can actually like actively make time for that, in that kind of balance of maker manager. So, and then can we bounce to the homeschooling component of all that?
Yeah. And so I just wanted to just bookend what you just said, about the freedom component, right? So like we have this freedom, but then with freedom comes responsibility, right? And that responsibility, from what I'm hearing from you, is to create a structure that allows you to maximize that freedom, right? So it's not like you just show up and like, okay, I'm free.
Right.
Like, I can just sort of do whatever, or just hope that things sort of magically work out. It's like, no, that's not how it works. You have to have a structure to maximize your freedom, because it's also the case, particularly in the social sector, that it's not just an individual freedom, right? That the structure is in place so that you can maximize the amount of good that you can create for others. So critically important, I think, what you gave us in terms of that framework.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, I've heard one thinker say, you can achieve freedom through discipline, and I don't necessarily agree with that, because I do feel like we're all, we all have a freedom that's accessible to us if we just decide, make that shift in our mind. But in this case, I understand that thought is you can get that enjoyment of the remote setting if you can create a structure that you stick to, and you're following it, you're doing the work, and you're following, a plan that's going to work for you. And there's not one formula, but like coming up with that plan and sticking to it, and then adjusting it little by little. Totally agree. That's the way to go.
Yes. So homeschooling. So you have this dual personal experience with this. So you have your experience having been homeschooled,
right?
But then now you are homeschooling. And I don't know if were you homeschooling before, or is this accidental because of COVID?
Yeah. So, interestingly, having been a product of homeschooling myself, I did not everybody has a good experience with it, because it's challenging, because you're with your parents and they're your teachers and all that. But in my case, I had a wonderful, very idyllic homeschooling experience. I was able to cut it academically when I went into a more formalized system, and it was great in so many ways. I'm so thankful for it. But I still knew that I was not the type of person to want to homeschool my kids. So I very clearly made that choice, and Kirsten and I made it together. And then we were just, that was not for us. We wanted to be professionals, and and then get the best possible schooling experience for our kids, but then and help them in every way, but not actually do that, have that relationship with them and do that. But then when COVID happened, we had to go to a more homeschooling type setup, and then we did have some structure from the kids' schools, so there was some remote setup, but it still requires a huge amount of interaction, especially with the kids at the ages of 5 and 9. They can't just do it themselves. And so they require a lot of guidance, getting things lined up and setting everything up and making sure that there's follow-up and all that. So yeah, it was incredible. I had this wonderful, beautiful system that I just outlined, in this conversation, just really nailed like remote work and everything. And then all of a sudden that just got completely exploded by also having to, homeschool at the same time. So it was a very humbling experience to have to redraw the entire system. And I don't know that we've necessarily succeeded fully, but, we try to apply the same approaches that we talked about, the principles on here, as far as like setting up a good structure. So we would actually like get out a whiteboard and write down, what everybody was doing at what hour of the day, and whether they're supposed to be online, doing their calls, or they're working offline, or, break time, meal time, all that, just like
so really family schedule.
Exactly. Like really written down in rigid detail.
Okay.
And trying to stick to it as best we can, but it's and then we would just divide the day up into 2 sections, where one parent was on on doing that focus with the kids and doing maybe some light work or no work. And then we would switch and the other parent would do, the other half of the day. And then I would, we would try to work on the off hours also in the early mornings and late nights to kind of compensate for that time shift. And, it was really painful at first, but I feel like with these kind of systems that we've talked about, looking at those ways of working, we were able to get to a functional place. And part of that is just the natural, it was really hard and we messed it up in all kinds of different ways at first. And part of it is learning the system. Part of it is just acclimatizing to anything. Humans have this incredible ability to adapt to any situation. It's both a blessing and a curse, but in this case, it's a blessing where we were able to, make something that was able to work for us. And then the higher level thought on the homeschooling side too is that I had a very unstructured homeschooling life, and my kids right now live a very structured life when they're in a normal school setup with a lot of details. But after the work is done, just making time in the day for them to have nothing and to just have to go either outside or inside and entertain themselves, whether it's reading or playing in different ways or doing different projects that they kind of come up with totally on their own. That has an extreme value. So that's the, both from my recent home experience being a parent homeschooling because of COVID and because of my earlier, life as a homeschooler growing up, I know that can be hugely beneficial, is to have that completely unstructured time. And I see that time dwindling for my own kids and for friends and community members who are who have that highly rigid and structured thing all the time. Like, you need some structure, but then it's okay to not have it part of the time and just let that free form living happen, and it can lead to good outcomes also.
That's awesome. And I'm curious because, Carlos, if you want to come on and share what your experience has been with this particular conversation, but it sounds like some of the principles that you talked about for remote work actually apply here, particularly around the scheduling, right? Having a clear schedule. So in the context of the family, make sure everyone, you have a schedule that has what everyone needs and when they need to do it together, whiteboard, Google Calendar, whatever you need to do to get it together. And then this sounds like the second thing you mentioned, which was, I'm assuming this is what you did over the years when you were refining your work from home process, which is you just tried things and saw what worked, right? And so that sounds like that's part of it, right? So there's going back to the mindset piece about, okay, we're just going to try this. This is new. We'll see what works. We'll do that, and then we'll adapt as we need to. Carlos, anything you want to share based on your experience with the homeschooling? How is any of this resonating with you?
Yeah, a whole lot of it does. Interestingly, we have children in the same age group. So my youngest is 6 and my oldest is 9. So they're right in that same grouping. So yeah, a lot of what you're saying, actually, it's interesting. I'll just pull this comment in just briefly, but this is my wife supporting our live stream.
She says, I agree.
She's agreeing with everything you said, Mark. And probably why she is agreeing is even though we both have had the opportunity to do remote work during this COVID-19 situation, she's been doing it full time from home, right? So I've had the opportunity to do partially in the office and at home, just because of the nature of the work that I do. But so the homeschooling burden and the remote work burden 100% had fallen on her. Yeah, so big ups to her for that. And then a question I have for you, Mark, was just interestingly enough, right? Most schools are out now for the school year, right? So here we are, summer session. Or summer, there are no sessions. Typical summer camps are not fully open just yet, right? So has there been any thought to your fine tuning of your system to what next, right? What is that entertainment activity, right? Because crafts and tablets and reading can only go so far and keep that attention, but the children need something to do while they're at home especially as parents are continuing to be required to get their work done, right? So
Yeah.
thought on that?
Yeah, definitely. There have been different chapters of our personal experience with this. The planning part of seeing it coming and maybe getting ready for it. Doing all the preparations that we could think of doing for COVID. Then like the initial part where you go into that more lockdown mode and you're trying to figure out your systems. Then the more normalization chapter where, okay, we have this figured out to a basic level. It's still hard, but we can make it happen. And then our most recent chapter is, oh my gosh, now it's going to keep happening all summer.
Right.
So, that feeling is what you're talking about with that. So, and this goes into risk management and decision-making in a uncertain context. And I think we're all faced with that right now, which kind of adds to the stress for so many people. And there is no clear answer on what to do. But, for us, like we've analyzed the situation. We feel like we're trying to expand out our quarantine bubble, if you will. So, before we were very careful of not including anybody else besides the four of us family and being as careful as possible. Now we're starting to, for the summer, we're basically doing our own DIY, do-it-yourself summer camp with one, possibly two other families where we trust that they're being as careful as possible so we can start spending time with them. And then we're basically rotating the kids between the three families' houses and doing, camp-like activities where we can, drop the kids off. Once we get this up and running, it's kind of in this early beta stages, but a kind of like collective summer camp where the kids are rotating between each family's house, and we have certain activities, outdoor activities that we can put together that do that. So we're going to try that and see how that works, and just take it from there. But that's our best response right now. And then of course, looking at decision making around the school year for next year, some places are. One thing that I've noticed that I wanted to share here is that I feel like there's a lot of convenience-based decision making that's happening now around COVID, and I see families doing it, and I totally understand why. But I just wanted to call that out and make sure that we're all thinking about like what's a real risk assessment, and there's still so many unknowns with the outbreak. Just to be cognizant of what is a convenience-based decision versus what is a smart risk mitigation decision, especially as we get into the later parts of summer and the school year potentially starting again. So I don't have any answers to that, but just wanted to bring that up.
So I mean, I know you don't have answers, but I'm curious. You have more expertise in this area than we do, and this precedes COVID-19. As we think about, and it's not just the U.S. This is around the world, right? So this is a forced work from home for folks that are able to do this, and then a forced homeschooling. I think I was looking at a UNICEF stat that was saying that more than 90% of the kids around the world are out of physical school.
Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So, and I'm not sure how accurate that is or how they're calculating that, but when we think about the fall and the plans to quote unquote go back to normal, what is your disaster preparedness, part of tell us like we should be thinking about, like what should parents be assessing to figure out what's the next step for them as they think about fall for their children?
Yeah. This is a huge question that we're all grappling with right now. So thanks for asking it in such a good way. In general, like from my professional background with disaster response and risk management, it's about looking at all the data and information and looking at practices that have worked in the past, so good practice, and then applying it to the uniqueness of the situation that's in front of you, making the best possible decision, then adjusting as you go, right? We're in a context where that things are changing quickly. So that's kind of an overview of the process. The hard part is with this one is that in a normal or more standardized risk management scenario, you have a lot of experience and good practice to go by that you can look to see what worked and what didn't work in the past. We have had pandemics before, but not and we do have various outbreaks that have come up. So we do have a good starting point, but still this one is unique enough that we don't have enough of a clear signal coming through all the noise right now to make definitive decisions. And for me personally, this is just a very personal decision related to like our kids in school, but it's a risk reward decision or process about what benefits are they getting from school at their ages versus what risks are there of this disease being in our communities. And the basic things that we need to have in place are universal testing, ability to contact trace, the personal protective equipment, and the ability to distance adequately. And we can get in a vaccine, of course, right? And so those would be the characteristics of things that I would feel would need to be in place to have the kids, go back to school without thinking twice about it. And none of those are really in place right now for us and our situation. So,
which brings me to my follow-up then, because what you just said mirrors exactly what public health experts are saying, and having myself worked in public health, I've been saying that for myself, that I'm not taking on any in-person engagements, especially through the end of this year, until there is, universal testing, we have an update on where we are with the vaccine and so on. So, but there seems to be this collective cognitive dissonance, right? It's just like, okay, well, we're restless.
Exactly.
We understand what you're saying about the public health. We understand what you're saying about the science, but we're restless. This is new. This is uncertain. There's all this anxiety. Is there anything from your disaster response experience that deals with that component of it, like the human nature of just simply like they get what you're saying, right? But there's also the very real, like, okay, the social isolation is beginning to take its toll.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a very real force. And I empathize, and I feel that, even in myself, this desire to like go back to, whatever the protocol was before, but there's always a tension between emotion and evidence, and intuition and evidence. Mm-hmm. And intuition can be a very powerful force, and you can use it positively if you develop enough experiences that can subconsciously guide. That's basically what expert judgment is, like a firefighter who can run out of a burning building just at the right time before the floor collapses, because they've seen that so many times and they know something is different. But that type of intuition doesn't apply when you have a new pandemic. And because of that, you have to go back to looking at the evidence and making an evidence-based, more slower, reasoned choice about all this, rather than just going for that emotional desire for things to be a certain way. And it's really hard. And as humans, we don't do that very well, but we have to just keep reminding ourselves about what the evidence is. And the problem is that there's not a clear evidence base yet. Every month it gets better, every day it gets better, but it's not there yet to have a scientific consensus on good practice around COVID-19. So for me personally, I'm going to hold back as long as possible until we get that evidence base in place and we can make evidence-based decisions. And so I think like you and I sound like we're really aligned about decision-making around the current state of things. But, obviously hoping and praying for acceleration in all those categories that we've seen, and all of us working towards getting the components in place, because we are moving towards a COVID endemic world, right? Like it's clear that this is not something that's just going to pass and go away. It's going to be around, but we've dealt with many different epidemics in the past, and we'll get through this one. It's just it's not going to be as fast getting through to a steady state with it as we would all like, but that's where my current thinking is now.
Well, awesome. Well, I appreciate you sharing that. You mentioned something really important about the evidence base, and I would argue that we do have evidence, and the evidence is that we have these known unknowns. And so we have to use the best available evidence, which is that we don't have a vaccine, that we don't have universal testing, that we don't have a system for contact tracing that's working as it needs to be working. And we haven't figured out what the post-COVID physical spacing is going to look like, and how it needs to be set up in such a way to actually mitigate future infection. So those things that we're aware of. So we have to, I think, work with what we do know, and make our best judgments with that. So with that being said, I want to see if you and Carlos have anything else you want to add as we wrap up. Carlos, is there anything you want to add before I give Mark the final word here?
No, let's go ahead and give Mark the final word. Mark, thanks so much for joining us today. There's a lot that you left for our viewers to digest on and put into action. So thank you for sharing such rich content today.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Carlos and Miko, for having me on the show today. It's been a pleasure to talk about these issues. I always enjoy catching up. And, there's a lot of uncertainty right now in the world with what's happening with social change and with the pandemic. But we do have this core set of principles and practices that are available from, across many different disciplines that we can learn about and apply to our own situations that can make decision making and work and life a lot more enjoyable, even in the face of these big challenges. So I encourage people to seek that out and just test it out in yourself and try to ride through these times. So thanks again.
Well, awesome. So thank you, Mark, for having us, for joining us on the show. And for folks that are watching, remember to love, like, and share this conversation. Tag folks that you think might be interested that are in your network that could benefit from this discussion that we just had about homeschooling and remote work in the era of COVID-19. And of course, join us here, same place, same time, every Tuesday at 5 p.m., where we'll be having more in-depth discussions at the intersection of mindfulness, work life, and tech life balance. So until next week, until next time, I want to thank you and look forward to seeing you.